Hello, everyone. We will get started in a few seconds. Just wanted to let everybody enter into the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Avoiding the Last Resort, Landfill Diversion and Why It Matters. Today's webinar is hosted by our partner Rubicon. Rubicon creates software to help communities better understand, optimize, and reduce waste. I'm going to cover a couple of logistics and then we will go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is being recorded. So once today's webinar is finished and the recording is available, I will send an email with the link as well as posting it on the website. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat or drop it in the Q&A box, and I will monitor those as we go through the presentation. All right, I think I have a raised hand. Let's see. Let me just check on this real quick. All right, that was really quick. I think it was Morgan. So if you could drop your message into the chat if you had a question, I would appreciate it. And if folks can let me know if the audio is okay, that would be greatly appreciated too. Just want to make sure there's no technical difficulties before we get started. All right, great. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenter today. Our presenter is Nick McCullough from Rubicon. Nick is the Director of Sustainability. Thank you so much, Nick. I'll go ahead and pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Christy. And yeah, this is the third webinar I think we've done with NWF in this quote unquote season of webinars. And it'll be the last one we're going to do this year, though I'm sure we'll be doing more soon. So I appreciate the platform, Christy, and you know, NWF more broadly, and have really enjoyed doing this, and also thank all of the attendees for you know, showing interest in attending. Hopefully we've been able to you know, deliver some level of insight. So yeah, today we're going to talk about landfills. And, you know, by extension, waste, and kind of what waste as a cultural and an industrial, as a social and environmental phenomenon has become, how it's changed, you know, the risks and threats that it poses, and then, you know, briefly touch on kind of, you know, this concept of regeneration and circularity, waste minimization, and you know, entertain maybe some things that we can do to hopefully minimize and eventually eliminate waste. So we can jump to the next slide. So, you know, when discussing waste, I don't think it necessarily makes sense to dwell on the history, but I do think, you know, when talking about waste and how to eliminate it, you know, a bit of historical context is often helpful. You know, it can add some more color to our understanding of waste's origins from a social and a cultural standpoint, which I think is helpful in maybe, painting a clearer historical arc, and better understanding our relationship to waste. I think it's pretty safe to assume that the management of unwanted byproducts of human activities has always been a concern, but became a kind of more major concern after the Neolithic Revolution. So the shift from, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle to an agricultural lifestyle, where we had, not bands traveling, but, kind of communities settling, and larger kind of congregations of humans. The earliest archaeological evidence of, kind of programmatic management of waste dates back to 5000 BC, and shows up in what is now modern day Crete, in the I guess at that point in time, the town of Knossos. But we can see subsequent evidence of waste management in some of these kind of more prominent cities, Rome, Jerusalem, Paris, where infrastructure or archaeological remains testify to our long-standing focus on managing and carrying away waste, kind of the sanitation systems and sewer systems, aqueducts of Rome, built kind of 2,500 years ago, were some of the earliest marvels of advanced engineering. So in some way, waste was an inspiration for some of our earliest engineering triumphs. Roman sewers and aqueducts allowed for the flow of water into the city and the disposal of sewage out of the city. The thing is, now waste is a little bit more of we'll call it a thing, a human problem. It's grander in scale and kind of more complicated in scope. So today I would say that the waste crisis that we are dealing with is a whole different ballgame in terms of the relationship between humans with quote unquote waste as a social construct than at any previous point in history. So let's jump to the next slide. So what has changed? Well, early on, waste took fewer forms. Sewage, agricultural and livestock waste, human remains. Today, we are dealing with so much more waste and in so greater a variety of physical forms. And, as a consequence, we're kind of dealing with more health impacts and impacts on the world, or the health of the world around us. Waste is so pervasive at this moment in time, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, many of the hundreds of different kind of articles and studies that have been conducted and published on the changing kind of landscape of waste. But one kind of thing that stuck out to me is the way that we are altering the geological record with waste. So, microbeads of plastic are now found in nearly all ocean creatures and this thing called, plastic crust. It's fugitive ocean plastics that are permanently bonding with coastal rocks are emerging. So we can imagine that at some point in the future, when our descendants are digging through what was formerly a lake, they're going to be really impressed by the fact that they find an entire layer of plastic rock. And I don't know that that's the legacy that we want to leave behind. Nor do I think that we necessarily want to be living in mountains of trash. Here I say the mounds of trash are quickly becoming some of the highest altitude points in an entire region. I think I pulled that from a stat about maybe New York City and kind of one of the landfills in the New York metropolitan area that was at one point in time, the point of highest elevation in the area. All of these things are, random statistics, but I think emblematic of the fact that we are unprepared or have been unsuccessful in effectively, to state the obvious, managing our waste in a long-term sustainable way. And when we trace back kind of, well, where did the pivot happen? What changed and where was kind of the inflection point? I think perhaps, for a lot of us intuitively and obviously, it began during the second half of the 18th century, at the point that we now call kind of the Industrial Revolution. Let's jump to the next slide. So, yeah, as I mentioned, 1750, the English, Industrial Revolution. Don't need to go into a history lesson, but obviously had substantial impacts and influence on kind of human migrations and the growth of cities, the increasing density of humans in specific and geographic areas, as well as the productive capabilities of our industrial practices. And so, one staggering statistic is just to illustrate the scale of industrialization and expansion of economic activity and productivity. So, between 1750 and 2000, the gross world product grew from $130 billion to $80 trillion. So, this industrial model that emphasized scale and efficiency and affordability, democratizing consumption emerged. And the consequence was, predictably greater consumption. And with that greater consumption came greater waste. So let's jump to the next slide. When we look at some of the prime indicators of waste proliferation, I think, something that's on the mind and one of the better indicators is plastic. Plastic has been an industrial game changer. It provides an important kind of part in cutting edge technologies. Plastics can, on occasion, have really positive benefits, like, reducing waste of food products by extending the life of perishable items. It's used as a primary component in vehicles to improve the fuel efficiency, reduce the weight. But as we've created more of these plastics, and I think in the last few decades, the focus has become not necessarily just, positive environmental impact or efficiency, resource efficiency, but also cost efficiency, which has resulted in things like, lightweighting and developing all different types of plastics, which has made, obviously recycling them incredibly difficult. The lighter they get and the flimsier they get, the less residual value they have, the less people are incentivized to recycle them. So we've kind of, snowballed and created a reinforcing feedback loop, and find ourselves at a place where, I joined Rubicon shortly after, in early 2019. So this was really like shortly after National Sword, which was, some people referred to as the China ban. It was basically, China saying to the United States, we're no longer going to accept your plastic waste exports, because frankly, what you're sending us is, 60% plastic and 40% trash, and we don't want the 40% trash. And so right now in the West, we find ourselves in the United States specifically, looking at 4 years later, a 95 million metric ton mountain of plastic waste that we were going to once send to China and then tried to send to other places in Southeast Asia, which is no longer going to happen, and are now displaced, and we're going to be forced to find a home for those plastics, or to alter our path and reduce them. But the consequence is we're in a crisis of plastic of sorts, and haven't yet come up really with a convincing plan of how we're going to deal with that. If we jump to the next slide. So, plastics aren't the only problem. We are also sending, in the United States, approximately 35 million metric tons of food to landfills on an annual basis. And, of kind of, I think that is actually the single largest contributor to emissions at landfill. Plastics do have an emissions footprint, but it's on a per pound or per ton basis substantially less. Regardless, our landfills are releasing about 110 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in methane into the atmosphere on an annual basis. And that represents 16.8%, more than 15% of our total anthropogenic domestic emissions on an annual basis. So suffice to say, if we want to get to net zero, if we want to successfully, avert kind of the most, catastrophic consequences of climate change, that landfill and addressing waste has to be a part of it. And this doesn't honestly tell the whole story. A study done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I think in conjunction with or partnership with a firm out of Europe called Circular Consultancy, something to that effect. They produced the circularity report on an annual basis. Estimated that of the total footprint of our total kind of global annual emissions footprint, which I think about 35 billion metric tons, that 45% of that was the result, the product of the production of physical goods, right? So building materials, food, clothes, vehicle components. And they also, underscored the fact that at the present moment, on an annual basis, so of all the materials that are the kind of volume weight of materials that are produced on an annual basis, only 9% of those are actually kind of reused. So they say we're 9% circular, and have a problem that 50%, almost 50% of our total emissions footprint as a human community is waste related. So beyond the 16.8% of anthropogenic emissions, and this doesn't even talk about or address the upstream impacts, right? So this doesn't include the embedded carbon, the embedded water, the embedded land use that is associated with things like food waste. All of those being finite resources that are precious and need to be conserved. So landfills are a real problem, and they house a substantial piece of our quote unquote climate problem. Beyond just the emissions standpoint, we can also talk about habitat destruction. In the United States, we do have a lot of land and a lot of quote unquote uninhabited or available land to build landfills on. Nonetheless, I think that's not the direction we want to move for obvious reasons, just looking at these emissions data, but also because we are currently using about 2,000 square miles of United States land, equivalent to the size of Delaware, to throw our trash into. Obviously, kind of habitat resilience, wildlife resilience and conservation are key components also of kind of addressing the climate crisis. And so also, another discussion that needs to be had. If we jump to the next slide. There's also a social component that I think is too often forgotten or not included in kind of public discourse around landfill, and probably because it's a more difficult conversation to have. But the history of landfills is very closely aligned with a history of environmental racism. Where have landfills been placed? Historically, more often than not, in minority and low-income areas, and that has come with a health impact. We think about kind of parallels like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, but the same thing is true of landfills. Landfill-related emissions and air pollution, according to some studies, have been associated with a 12% increased risk of congenital malformations in children born within a mile of landfills. Again, disproportionately impacting minority communities. And in terms of, kind of inequality from a socioeconomic standpoint, landfills have been shown to decrease the value of adjacent land by 12.9%. So obviously, in terms of, kind of constructing wealth for communities that have been historically marginalized and do not possess the same intergenerational wealth. Landfills have not been a positive thing. And then, kind of one last environmental piece was, we hear a lot about, and this is true, that kind of landfill practices have improved over time, and they are now using kind of liners under the kind of, mountains of waste to prevent leakage and leachate, but most landfills still leak. And I live here in Colorado, where maybe we're not quite as bad off as the rest of the West in terms of water shortages, but we certainly don't need additional groundwater pollution. And stats from the EPA show that between like 1/10 and about 0.5% of groundwater is polluted by landfills and industrial reservoirs. So again, an environmental externality that perhaps we cannot afford. So next slide. So what can be done? Divert. Probably a little bit reductive, but eliminating waste. Reducing the need for landfills is the best place to start. So at Rubicon, we kind of have adopted a pretty standard kind of discourse, but a standard approach to circularity that focuses on kind of three primary pillars of circularity. So one, designing out waste from products and materials. So, this is primarily focused on packaging. But this means kind of designing packaging and products so that they are more recycled, so that they are, or so I guess better perhaps than that, easier to recycle and more streamlined, that they are increasingly kind of composed of a higher percentage of recyclable materials. It involves using kind of more materials, more products that are reusable, better designed to reduce the kind of single-use addiction that we've developed over the last 20 years. Kind of dovetailing with that is, using products and materials for longer. So by designing better products that are more durable, by advocating for things like right to repair bills, we can perhaps hold on to our phones and our computers, and maybe even our cars for a little bit longer. And by stretching them, kind of the lifespan of those products and materials, we also extend the life of that embodied carbon. Again, extending the life of the materials that we use, not being such quick, kind of buyers and throwers away of things. And then three, the regenerative aspect. So, making sure that we're scaling up composting, that we are focused on kind of agricultural practices that are regenerative. The way that we're kind of using land is more regenerative, and making sure that we are, conserving and maintaining the kind of productivity of our natural systems. in kind of real terms and practical terms, as you know, people who may manage waste and recycling programs, composting programs at universities or other institutions, maximize your non-landfill services. If you don't know how, reach out to Rubicon. We have seen substantial, and I guess this is a good sign, substantial increases in our organics tonnages under our management over the last 3 years. I think we've seen 400% growth over 3 years in the tons of organics materials that we're managing for our customers. And growing interest in kind of reusable schemes and waste reduction schemes also. So understand your kind of waste footprint, do the audits or stick the sensors on the bins, and get to know your trash, and divert everything that you possibly can. I think on a more structural, and kind of cultural basis, it's important not to forget that regulation and fixing kind of broken incentive systems is a really important part of the equation. So advocate for policies such as extended producer responsibility. We were really fortunate to participate in and sign on to a commitment to or I guess a defense of extended producer responsibility for packaging with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2020. And we're like really thrilled to see that within 6 months of us like standing behind that policy, that kind of mission, that it was cited in, I think, the Oregon State House. It was the Oregon State House or the Washington State House, as they passed. I think it was the second piece of EPR legislation, or statewide EPR legislation in recent United States history. Since that time, we've seen, Colorado and California recently come out with extended producer responsibility kind of regulations, legislation, and those are going to be absolutely critical to, preparing the playing field and giving, kind of waste reduction and recycling programs a chance from an economic standpoint, financial standpoint. And then, finally, kind of spread the circular message, evangelize the idea of waste reduction. Engagements like this are my opportunity, and I kind of take, I guess, every chance to annoy everybody around me, and talk about circularity and what can be done. But I think, the more that we can make people aware of not only the challenges and the consequences of how we're currently doing things, but also the ways in which they can contribute and participate, and the positive impacts of their participation, I think tends to inspire and engage individuals, and we need all of the individuals engaged and participating that we can get. So with that said, I think I can open it up for any questions. And just again, want to thank Christy and NWF and all of you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. Yes, folks, if you have questions, please, you can drop them into the chat or you can drop them into the Q&A. So I have one question So does Rubicon have any programs, grants that work specifically for schools?
So at present, we do not have, I don't think any grant programs. I would say that's not something we're kind of opposed to entertaining. In terms of programs for universities, I think I would, and this is kind of me bailing out, no, but refer you to our vice president of circular economy solutions. And I can kind of provide his contact information here. His name is Ryan Cooper. And he has helped specifically he's one of the kind of leading experts in organics, recycling, sits on the US Composting Council Board of Directors, and has helped universities establish really successful organics recycling programs. So he is somebody I would refer you to. Let's see. I can see this. I feel like there's a double-edged sword with encouraging diversion. If folks are undereducated, not engaged, contaminating the compost recycling streams is not a solution. Yeah, how do you approach the knowledge piece? Yeah, it is. It is tough, and I think probably many of us on here know the contamination is a real problem. We're seeing rates of 25-30% contamination. So it's clear that there are many instances when people try, but they don't have the knowledge to do it right, because it can be really complicated, and we haven't made the system uniform across not only states but cities and zip codes. So training is something we're actively working on internally, externally, for customers. I think the best you can do is within the kind of the context of a specific environment, is to make instructions as clear as possible. So be as specific as you possibly can be when it comes to what you can accept, what you can't accept. I know it seems like a trivial piece of the puzzle, but it's bitten me in the behind several times when I've overlooked it, and that is signage. I think additionally, you've got to have ongoing feedback and engagement. It's got to be a conversation. So there needs to be a cadence of doing a waste audit, or at least measuring progress, kind of identifying what's working, identifying what's not working, and making sure that you're communicating that out. I know it can be like an exhaustive and seemingly unending kind of process, but that's what I have found kind of works. Again, in conjunction with the public policy kind of advocacy piece, which really is maybe the biggest lever we can pull in terms of making recycling easier and more effective.
So Nick, I have one more question. It's in the chat. It says, I live in a rural area in the Midwest. Do you have any advice on what we can do, or what I could encourage folks in this area to do?
Yeah, I mean, it would obviously depend on the specific kind of availability. So, if it's a question of, do you have recycling available or not? If you don't, that's kind of obviously one challenge that necessitates, kind of pushing for the establishment of, a kind of service in that area. That is something that Rubicon does. We are really kind of passionate and understand the importance of continuing to expand circular infrastructure, recycling, composting infrastructure in areas that do not currently have access to it. So if that's a question, then I would say reach out to me, reach out to us, and we'd be happy to kind of look into that for you. If it's a question of kind of, cultural appetite, I think there are communicative strategies, and again, something I'd be happy to discuss. There are communicative strategies that I think can depoliticize the kind of environmental aspects of recycling. When I did my first job as an environmental sustainability manager was in North Texas. And, there were days when I felt like some people there just maybe kind of out of a binary understanding of, recycling environmentalism left, destroying the earth, right? Seemed to like actively sabotage, like they felt it was a part of their identity to proactively waste. And so sometimes there are really like kind of, tough conversations that you have to have, but I think there are definitely better and worse ways of having those conversations. And so would be really happy to, engage you on kind of where you live, and if indeed that's what you're asking, and what kind of like communicative strategies might work there.
All right, thank you for responding to those questions. All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A box. I do have one more slide. I do have a raised hand, I believe. Let's check. Those raised hands pop up so quickly and then they go away. So if anybody has a question, please drop it in the chat. I can also unmute you, but like I said, your hand went away really quickly, so I'm not sure who that was. So my apologies. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. So if there are any questions or you would like me to unmute you, just let me know. I'm going to just do one more slide. All right, so we have a couple of upcoming webinars. Now, these are competition-specific webinars for the 2023 Campus Race to Zero Waste. So I just wanted to highlight these for you. We have one next week, November 16th, about tracking and reporting for the competition, and then one after the Thanksgiving holiday on tips, best practices, resources to engage your campus community. So that one will touch on what resources we have online in terms of downloadable resources, competition ideas, activity ideas, that type of thing. So 2 more webinars, competition specific for our 2 last webinars for 2022. And you can go to the website, campusracetozerowaste.org, and click on resources to check those out. Now I wanted to go back up to this slide. So Nick, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. There's a lot of great information in this presentation today. Like I said, folks, the webinar was recorded. I will share the link with you as soon as it's available. I will also post it on our website. And please feel free if you have, let's see, I have one chat. Perfect. Thank you.
Stick my email in there if anybody wants to reach out directly.
Right. We did have one question that was campus specific in terms of solutions. So I please encourage you to reach out to Nick to follow up on that. All right. Well, thank you all. Nick, a special thank you. And for all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Take care.